little background. I am from Glenmore, Banyuwangi, Indonesia. I work at a busy chemicals and perfumes factory for laundry. The place is on a narrow street between large farm fields and oil refineries. Since my home is a long way, I sleep in the factory bunks. This is where I encountered a lot of paranormal things. First, I remember it was a sunny and very hot afternoon. There was nobody in the factory because it was a holiday. I was the only one there because I had to check machinery routinely to make sure everything was in order. Suddenly, I heard a very loud bang, like somebody had punched the tables in front of me. And when I looked, there was a white smoke emerging from it, almost like a vape smoke, but much thicker and denser. It disappeared after that. It wasn't from chemicals or any of the other things going on in the factory. It was very strange. It almost looked like the smoke was aware of my presence. Second, one time I was trying to sleep and I couldn't close my eyes, even though I felt very sleepy. I just couldn't close them. It was like I was waiting for something to show up, and eventually something started to. I can only sleep like 2 to 3 p.m., and all the while, almost every time, there's this shadow-like figure. It flies through the machines, or it will crawl beside the bed. I feel afraid, but there's nothing I can do about it. My body freezes still every time that I try to stand to watch it. It's a terrifying experience, and it happened every single time that I would try to sleep there. Third, this happened like a month ago. It was raining on a Sunday night. I was still inside the factory, waiting until the rain stopped. I walked into the kitchen to make myself some coffee, and that's when I heard a whispering voice inside the women's bathroom. I know that it's only me in there, and everyone else has gone home. But it's very clearly a voice, just humming. It was raspy though. It almost sounded like a woman in pain, humming to soothe herself. The next second, it was whispering some kind of words that I couldn't understand. My body got really cold, and I started to shake. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. It was like something was holding my feet tightly. The whisper became louder. My eyes actually started tearing up. I kept thinking, I can't handle this, I just want to cry. But I couldn't even do that. Finally, after 20 or 30 seconds of this, I broke the hold and got out of there. I didn't care if it was raining. It was better than being in there. A lot of other things have happened at that factory, but those 3 were the scariest. I want to quit, but it has a decent salary, and so ultimately I stayed. And I still do. I still work there, and I still have to spend the night there sometimes too. Things keep happening, but so far, nothing as scary as all of those things. But I'm sure it's only a matter of time. This happened like 8 minutes ago, and I'm pretty confused, so I decided to come and tell my story. Maybe some of you know what's going on. I saw a car pull up in the parking lot. I'm working security. It parked beside my truck, and it was the only car there. At first I couldn't tell if it was a cop, because it had no lights on the top, and the cameras don't show enough detail to see the writing. It was also an unusual model, definitely not current, but not super old either. Anyway, I went outside to confront the car, because as far as I knew, they were up to no good, and I didn't like them being beside my truck. I go outside and I start walking toward them. but immediately the car drives to the other side of the parking lot and around the building. There's no exit that way. I see that it says police on the door, so I go back in to see what they're doing before proceeding, and the car is nowhere to be found. The cameras record everything when movement is detected, so I looked back at that time slot, but the car isn't on the feed at all. I appear in the footage walking out of the building. There's no way that the cameras wouldn't detect a car driving in a huge circle around the lot. And I didn't imagine it. I'm very well rested, very alert as I work third shift every night, and I slept 9 hours before coming in. I'm just very confused about what I saw and why the cameras couldn't. I live on a 20-acre horse ranch in the panhandle of Florida, about a half hour from the Alabama border, and 15 minutes ago, I heard the strangest animal sound I've ever heard, if it was an animal. It happened almost right outside the property, which is only about 50 feet away from where I am now. It was a very loud whistle. I heard it 4 times, spaced out by like 15 to 30 seconds, and each whistle was different, no repeating tunes or notes. It was loud enough to sound like it was echoing across the property. After the 4 independent whistled tunes, it was followed by a sound that almost sounded like a frustrated sigh. Then nothing. Then the whole thing would start all over again. I sat there listening to this, like somebody was just facing the property outside the fence line, whistling 4 different tunes, huffing in frustration, and then doing it again. What's even stranger is that it was dead quiet while this was happening. Shortly after the silence, I could hear a pack of coyotes in the distance, which happens all the time. The owls over the lake, which is also frequent. But while this was happening, I didn't hear any of that. Also, to be clear, where the sound was coming from is an open field. It's so dark I can't see my hand in front of my face when I go out there. The weirdest thing is, we're more likely to hear gunshots than other people out here. The closest neighbors are like a half-mile away in the other direction. This sound came from the road side of the property. The closest neighbors in that direction are over a mile away. We also have 2 donkeys on the property to ward off predators, and I didn't hear either of them warning the herd, which would mean that maybe it was a human I was hearing. But like I said, the property is fenced and gated, so they would have had to hop the fence. And whistling is a really weird thing to do when you're trespassing in an area where shooting is common. Update. It's now 30 minutes after the initial thing happened. I hear the horses running fast away from where the sound originated. Then, about a minute later, I hear their hooves heading back to where the sound originated. This happened several times. I am really confused. My friend and I camped on his property in the middle of nowhere. It was in the area of Cane Creek, Kentucky, near Laurel Lake. There was no service, no noise, no anything but you and the woods. We set up our tent under an overhang, and I was tasked with gathering the firewood. It was about 5 p.m. or so, and while collecting, I got this odd feeling. And then I started to hear whispers. They weren't saying anything I could make out. It was just murmurings. At that point, I got this creepy, odd feeling, and I moved closer to our camp to collect the firewood. I didn't want to stray very far after that. Night progresses and nothing out of the ordinary happens, until we climb into our sleeping bags. I heard footsteps in the leaves and more murmuring. I was getting really freaked out, but I know the best thing to do is to ignore it and sleep, and so I did. The following morning, my friend and I found ourselves awake at 5 a.m. He asked me if I had heard whispering last night. I told him I heard it twice, and we were both just as baffled as the other. We were not the first people to camp in this area. His uncle and his friends attempted to camp there as well, but they couldn't make it through the night either. My dad is a hunter, and he refuses to go down there to hunt anymore, as well as another friend I have. His dad says that the air down there is rich in death. I don't know the reason for what happens down there, but I won't be going back. At the time of this event, I was living in downtown Toronto, and I had just moved in with my new roommates. One guy was my buddy. The place I moved into used to be a shoe factory years ago, so the new place was great. I was chilling with my buddy and our other roommates. Joe and I made a joke about how this place must be haunted because of how old it is. Joe kind of brushed off what I was saying, though, and joked that if he told me stories, I would move out. Joe's been living there for like 20 years, so I don't doubt that he's seen some things. Before I get into the stories, I wanted to clarify that I'm not sure if I believe in ghosts. My attitude has always been that I can't really prove or disprove their existence, or of anything paranormal really. I've experienced quite a few strange encounters in my lifetime, but nothing to really sway my opinion that ghosts exist 100%. So it was a weekend night. I stayed up really late. It was like 3 or 4 in the morning, and I went out to the living area to get some water. As I was filling my water bottle, the whole time I was out there, I felt like something was drawing my attention toward the TV or couch area. The TV was always on. I don't know why. I feel like my roommates were just too lazy to turn it off. So I'm stumbling toward the couches, and I could make out the shape of somebody's head from behind it. It was kind of this white transparent color. All I can remember is that as I got closer, there was this static from the TV that kept getting louder until the TV finally made a big pop noise. I ran back to my room. I just stood there in complete shock. I didn't move for like 5 minutes, just trying to comprehend what had happened. As I said before, I don't really believe in ghosts, but this scared me really badly. I've never felt an energy or something like that before. It's really hard to explain how I felt during that experience, but it gives me goosebumps just remembering it. The second story took place in the daytime. I was alone in the apartment, cooking some brunch. In the apartment, there was a section of walls that were covered in mirrors. Joe made kind of a makeshift gym in front of them. So I was doing my normal thing, just cooking, but the whole time I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me with a sharp glare. Like I said, the TV is always on, so when you're cooking in the kitchen, you can see in the mirrors the TV area reflected. As I'm cooking, this glitter or flash of light would pierce the corner of my eye, like somebody was trying to get my attention. This happened about 3 times. I'm starting to get more freaked out because the whole vibe of the apartment just felt really negative, which was odd. As I'm finishing up, the door to my room just shuts. It had been halfway open. When that happened, I just left the apartment to get some fresh air. I didn't even touch the food I had just got done cooking. What really doesn't make sense about this is that the doors we had in that place were really heavy. They had soundproofing on them, so when you went to close them, you really had to pull on them. Those were the two really big things I had happen while I was living there. When I was living there, I had a girlfriend that would stay over all the time. I never mentioned anything about ghosts to her. We never talked about ghosts either when I was living there. It wasn't until I had moved out and we were on a date that I brought it up to her. All I asked her is if she ever saw or felt anything strange while I was living there. What she told me was pretty shocking. She told me about how she would have nightmares every once in a while, where something would climb up to where we would sleep and attack her. The apartment had like 8-meter ceilings, so the sleeping area was at the top. This freaked me out, because one time I had had a dream that somebody climbed up there and grabbed my feet. I actually woke up from that dream screaming. She also explained that she felt like there were multiple spirits there, some good, some bad. She's way more spiritual than I am. So I had a hard time wrapping my head around what she had said. She said she felt that there was a mix, like I said, good ones and also dark ones. Anyway, that was my experience living in this apartment that used to be a shoe factory. There were other instances of things happening, weird noises, doors closing, the normal. But these two events really stood out. I know this story is going to sound weird and crazy, but hear me out. I'm not too familiar with this subreddit, but a friend of mine who's always talking about metaphysics, the Twilight Zone, simulation type stuff, loves this sub and keeps telling me to post my story. Anyway, here's my story. 2 weeks ago, I was about to get ready for a party at 6. Just before I started getting ready, one of my friends messaged me, super excited, because a guy she's had a crush on for the last 4 years finally asked her out, and he was coming to the party with her. While I was texting her back, my younger brother walked into the room and asked if I could drive him to his friend's house, which I agreed to do. Then I went into the bathroom to have a shower and do my makeup. So I got in the shower, but when I went to wash my hair, I realized that my conditioner was finished. I was pretty ticked off because I had only bought it a couple of days beforehand, and it's an expensive brand. My younger sister always uses up my things, so I knew that she had used it all. She had also trashed the bathroom, leaving water everywhere and her dirty towel on the floor. I was pissed off, and I was about to get out of the shower in order to tell her off and get some more conditioner. But as I went to get out, I realized at the last second that she'd kicked the grippy mat that we have at the bottom of our shower tub up. Our shower and tub is super slippery without the grip mat, so as I went to step out, before I could realize it, my foot slipped and I fell neck down onto the edge of my tub. Time seemed to slow down in my head, and I remember that my last thought was, wow, this is how I die? How stupid. But here's the thing. At the moment of impact, I woke up in a start, back in my bed. I know, it sounds stupid and cheesy like something from a dumb Netflix show, but there's literally no other way to describe what happened. I was lying in my bed right before I got up to shower the first time, but I don't remember falling asleep. And the thing is, I've been a lucid dreamer for the last 5 years or so. And if this was a dream, it was way more vivid than anything I have ever experienced. What really weirded me out, though, was that the exact same friend who texted me the first time messaged me after I woke up to tell me that the guy she'd had a crush on had asked another girl out, and that she was really bummed out about it and didn't want to come to the party. I was weirded out that there was some similarity between that and the dream, but I didn't think about it much at first. As I went to reply, my younger brother came in to ask if I would take him to his friend's house. All the blood drained from my face. He just stood in the doorway looking confused and asked me what was wrong. I rushed to the bathroom, feeling like I was losing my freaking mind, and I went to check the conditioner bottle. I know this sounds completely crazy, but the bottle was finished just like before, and the grip mat was kicked up. At that point, I went back to lie down in bed and I texted my friends to tell them that I would not be going to the party. I'm pretty sure that I slipped in the shower, died, and then woke up in some alternate dimension. I know it sounds kind of crazy, but I really don't know how else to explain this series of events. In any case, it's rattled me ever since. A few years ago, when my daughter was 3, I decided to go back to school and become a nurse. My husband and I were in no way trying for a baby whatsoever. I was on birth control and we were very careful. I walk into her preschool one day to find the director and her teachers telling me congratulations with big smiles on their faces. I used to work as a preschool teacher there, so a lot of these people were close friends of mine. I ask them what they're congratulating me for, and they tell me that my daughter announced to everybody that mommy has a little sister in her tummy. I laughed it off and I told them all that I was sorry to disappoint them, but this just wasn't true. My daughter and I went home and talked about it. I told her mommy didn't have a baby in her tummy, and she just kept pointing at my belly and saying, "Yes, you do." She was very upset, as though I were lying to her. A few days later, I wake up to somebody touching my belly. My daughter has the bottom of my shirt pulled up, with her head resting on my belly while she rubs it gently, and says, "Baby sister, what are you doing hiding in there?" It was really sweet, and I just assumed that she really wanted a little sister. She had never expressed any interest in having a sibling prior to this, and we had never discussed it, but that's just what I assumed. We had the talk again, and she got really upset with me. She said, "I've seen her before. She's in there." She told me that her sister looks different than us and has blonde hair and blue eyes with little holes in her cheeks, aka dimples. My daughter, husband, and I all have very dark hair, chocolate brown eyes, and no dimples. I talked to her about wanting a sibling and tell her that when I finish school, we'll try to give her a little brother or sister. Again, she's yelling, "I already have a sister." I was expecting to start my period within the next week like clockwork. I didn't. I took a pregnancy test and just stared at that faint positive result for what felt like forever. I was completely in shock. I was on birth control, so immediately I called my doctor and they saw me the next day. It was estimated that I was 4 weeks and 6 days pregnant. I gave birth to a blonde-haired, blue-eyed little girl with the sweetest dimples. This experience has always blown my mind. I moved into my house about 2 years ago. It's a generally decent-sized property with 14.5 acres. I don't hate this house, but it is 100% cursed. I've always felt really uneasy going into the wooded area of this property. I would never go in there alone because I got really scared. I know that sounds very childish, but hear me out. There's a small abandoned cottage or shed in the woods, and that's the part that's always made me feel very faint, going within a 5 to 10 foot radius of it. There didn't seem to be anything particularly odd about this building, and there was nothing around it. A couple of months went by, and I decided to go in alone, just to face my fear of those woods. I came upon the building and stayed on the trail so I wouldn't get dizzy and start to faint. This in particular scared the living bejesus out of me, because I was looking at the building, and I saw a woman circling it, humming lullabies, and calling out for something. I think she was between the height of maybe 5'10" and 6 foot, with dark hair that went down to about her hips, and very pale skin. She was wearing a long white dress or nightgown that went down to her ankles, and held a children's toy in her hand. I called out, "Hello?" And she just stared at me, still humming and circling the building, but looking at me. I made the very dumb decision to step into that 5 to 10 foot radius, and she lunged for me. I started running for my life out of the woods, and she just kept chasing me. The second I stepped outside the tree line, though, I turned around and she was gone. It wasn't until later that I was reflecting on it, and I thought, wait a minute, I recognized that toy she was holding. I had the exact same one when I was little. After that, I started to go back. She's not always there when I go into the woods, but when she is, she's always holding a different children's toy, all of which were toys or plushies that I had as a kid or grew up with in my home. One of them was a big plush that I've had since I was born. I still have it because it's kind of my comfort item. But hers was an exact duplicate. That's what scared me the most. I'm pretty sure I'm not crazy, so my only conclusion is that I'm dealing with something very paranormal. This is an experience I had a few years ago, which made me a believer in the paranormal. I hope you find it as interesting and creepy as I did. I went out very early in the morning, about 5 a.m., to take photos in the forest. I've always liked the vibe of the forest, especially during early mornings, since it has a kind of calmness to it. I live in central Sweden, where we have many deep forests everywhere. Much of it is untouched. Think plenty of moss and old-growth trees. This particular forest I went to was quite near my home. However, since I lived in the countryside, I was very alone, with no other soul around. During this morning, there was also fog lingering in the treetops from the surrounding rivers, which looked really cool, to be honest, so I was very ready to go take some awesome photos. I went into the forest after parking my car along the road that went beside it, and I started walking straight in. After maybe 100 meters, I stopped to take some photos, mostly of dead trees and mushrooms and things like that. I was 20 and I felt very artsy. After a few minutes, I started hearing knocks on the trees. Probably a bird, I thought, since we do have woodpeckers around here. So I didn't think that the sound was too unusual. The strange thing is that I started looking for it, since it came from a tree that was right beside me, but I couldn't find it. Unlucky, I thought. I wanted to see if I could get a nice photo of the bird, but I decided to move on. I continued walking into the forest when I noticed something. The knocking or pecking seemed to follow me as I walked. It continuously knocked on the trees closest to me. At this point, I still didn't think too much about it, but that would change after a while. I stopped at a spot that looked really nice to set up my camera on a tripod, in an attempt to maybe snap some cool photos of the surrounding area and treetops. I sat down and continued to hear this knocking on a tree just a few meters behind me. At this point, I started to feel a little weird about it, since I had started to notice how it followed me. A few seconds later, while changing my camera settings, I suddenly heard several very loud and very clear heavy footsteps behind me that rapidly approached until they were right behind me. My whole body froze. I have not until this day experienced chills like that through my whole entire body. After what felt like several seconds, I flew up and spun around to what I thought was going to be some kind of a big animal, but nothing was there. For context, besides a few trees, this area was not particularly dense. Just a few trees here and there, but mostly moss and grass, like a clearing. I picked up all my things and started walking quickly back toward my car. And that's when the knocking started again. It followed me again, and I just knew that something was mocking me. Feeling a little silly, I said, "I'm leaving, okay?" I knew that whatever it was didn't want me there. I continued to hear the knocking until I came back to the spot where I first started hearing it. And then it just stopped. I, on the other hand, did not. I went straight back to my car and I went home. Before this, I was pretty skeptical about the paranormal, but this really changed my views. Since then, I've only had one other experience that I consider paranormal, but this is the one that scared me the most. I live on a 13-acre property in the area of my state where the suburbs turn to rural farmland. My parents live in the main house near our road, while my fiancé and I converted one of the barns on the back half of the property into our house. Our house and another barn are set in a pretty wide clearing and pasture, but beyond that, we are surrounded by woods on 3 sides. All of this to say, we don't get many visitors out here. From the time we moved into the house almost a year ago, there have been some occasions where I get this inexplicable feeling of terror while outside at night. I've lived in the woods my whole life, including in places far more remote than here, but I have never had this feeling. The woods are my home. In every other place I've ever lived in them, they felt like my woods, but not here. I have repeatedly had the feeling that I am trespassing on someone else's land, someone who is not happy to have me here. The other night, I took my dog out for his last walk of the day. So it was pitch black, outside of the ring of light cast by the floodlights on the side of the house. As I was walking toward the edge of the tree line, where my pup likes to do his business, I heard a sound, like someone imitating the hoot of an owl, coming from the direction of the other barn, about 30 yards away to our right. I was so certain that it was a human mimicking an owl that I called out, "Ha ha, very funny, Dad." I assumed it was my father closing up the barn for the night, and he was taking an opportunity to try to spook me. But no one called back. It was at that point that my dog lifted his head from sniffing all over and froze, staring in the direction of the barn. His hair stood up along his spine, and he started to give a low, menacing growl. Now, this dog is obsessed with all people and animals. Everyone is a friend just waiting to be made. I've never seen him act aggressively toward anything, even other dogs that have tried to fight him. My dad, especially, is his favorite person on the planet, so there's no way he would have started growling at him. It was my turn for all the hair on my neck to stand up as a cold wave of fear hit me like a brick wall. My dog had stopped right at the edge of where the light met the darkness of the woods. Normally, the light gradually dissipated into the trees, still providing enough visibility to see the outline of trees and shrubs. But this time, it ended with a solid wall of black. Suddenly, I heard the same fake owl sound from only a few feet away, just on the other side of the darkness. My dog jumped and immediately started barking, putting himself between me and the sound. He's only a little guy, so I darted forward, scooped him up, and took off running toward the house. Behind me, I heard the sound again, but this time it had a strange warble to it, almost like somebody was trying to mimic an owl while laughing. The next morning, when I went out to check on the barn, I found the doors had been partially broken off the slide and were swung past each other in the wrong direction, like someone had tried to force them open the wrong way. But there were no signs of anybody, not a footprint, not a cigarette butt, no signs of an intruder at all. I have no idea what was out there that night, but suffice to say, my dog and I stay well within the floodlights when we go out after dark now. I feel creeped out even typing this story. I'm staying at my friend's house in Tennessee over winter break, and tonight I helped her feed the neighbors' dogs because they were out of town. Her house is in a somewhat rural area. There are clusters of homes kind of spread across fields, forests, and lake areas, all very beautiful and full of lots of wildlife. It's about 9 p.m., and it's way past sunset. It's quite dark, and we're walking the short distance from the neighbor's house back to hers. We are on a road, but directly next to us is a small wooded area sloping down to the lake. I'm a little nervous about it, so I make a joke like, "That forest is kind of creeping me out. Imagine if there's a skinwalker out there." She laughed and gobbled like a turkey loudly into the forest. Jokingly, I said, "Don't do that, it'll attract one." Not 5 seconds later, we hear an identical gobble back to us from the forest. It was definitely not an echo. There was no light out there, no paths, and it was very cold, like 30 degrees. I can't imagine anybody would just be hanging out in the woods on the off chance they could mock somebody. What's weirder is that it sounded like her. It sounded as though somebody had recorded her voice and played it back. I just remember saying, "Oh my God," and then sprinting as fast as I could back to the house. I don't think I've ever run so fast or with so much intention in all my life. I didn't turn back, and I was so out of breath it hurt. My friend thought the whole thing was funny, but I didn't. It was so freaky. Did we see or encounter a skinwalker? Or was it something else? A former coworker is back from the dead. This is one of the biggest personal glitches I have ever had. I work in the admitting department of my local hospital. One of the things I do is keep track of obituaries. When someone's obituary appears in the newspaper, I check to see if they still owe the hospital money. If they do, I clip the obit, fill out a form, and then keep track of how their insurance pays and things like that. A few years ago, and I've worked there for over 20 years, one of my coworkers in the dietary department retired and passed away soon after. I know because I processed her obituary. This coworker's daughter was really good friends with my cousin, so the daughter was even over at my cousin's house the day after my coworker's funeral. They had a big wake for her mother and everything. Today, as I'm working ER registration, the daughter comes in and says that her mom is in the ER. I was brought up a little short. I thought, what? I didn't say anything for a moment, so my office mate had to step in for me and look up this lady's mother. Sure as heck, it's the woman who died years ago. My office mate lets the daughter back into the ER to see her mom, and I am unable to find the obit form that I filled out. Edit number 1. I heard back from my cousin, and he's as weirded out as I am. Coworker's daughter has no memory of the wake or anything, but she said she's been getting this stuff from the people around her for the past few days. People remember her mom dying, even funeral details and the like, but the coworker's daughter doesn't remember any of it. Plus, her mom is right there. Really freaky. Edit number 2. Spoke with cousin instead of texting him. Coworker's daughter said that it was her dad that died and not her mom, but she also said that's not the way that any of the people who run into her remember it. They're asking where her dad is, how he is today. He's not answering his phone or texts. To her, the man had been dead for over 10 years. Edit number 3. I've been asked if I had any close calls or moments where I could have slipped from one universe to another. And yes, there was one. It was a little over 2 years ago. I was getting my evening medications together, but I was tired and I screwed them up. I ended up taking an entire full bottle of glipizide, which is a medication that lowers your blood sugar. I accidentally took enough to kill a horse. I realized it right as I laid down for a nap due to extreme exhaustion, and I felt really, really weird going to sleep. Looking back on it, maybe I fell asleep forever there and woke up here. Final edit. I've been getting a lot of angry replies about what happened with the glipizide. So this is the full story. I take a lot of medications for a lot of stuff, so I have a lot of empty pill bottles lying around. That day, I had an empty pill bottle with the label still on it, so I figured I would just grab all of my evening med doses out of my bedroom, take them to the dining room, and just swallow them with dinner. I've done it loads of times before. Like I said, I was tired that night, so when I pulled out my bottle of glipizide, I got my dose and then accidentally closed the bottle with my evening meds in it, put it back where the bottle of glipizide went, and then took the full bottle of glipizide with me to the dining room. I wasn't paying attention. I didn't look at the bottle when I took my meds that evening. I just threw the pills back and swallowed them with dinner. The pills were tiny, and all I noticed was that they didn't feel quite right in my mouth. I didn't think anything else about it though, because the idea of taking a whole bottle of pills seemed ludicrous to me. I mean, what kind of idiot would do something like that? Me, apparently. When I stumbled back to my bedroom, I checked the bottles, because something was very, very wrong. I discovered the rest of what should have been my evening meds in the bottle. I had mistakenly put the glipizide in its place, and that's when I saw that I had downed the full bottle. I wanted to grab my husband and holler and shout, but my body was made of lead. I could only crawl over to my bed and flop on it, and when I woke up, everything was fine. That's what I mean by going to sleep there and waking up here. I don't think that I woke up back in that place, that other dimension. I think I died there and I woke up in this one. I tell that story because that's why I think that perhaps, just maybe, that person did die in the other universe, but not in this one. In any case, it's freaked me out ever since. I live in the mountains, and my hollow is surrounded by woods. There's a little spot you can walk into in the woods, which is just a giant circle with trees open all around it. My friend and I have gone to picnic there, and this day that we went there, we started hearing this flute. It was really loud, and it was coming from a direction where there were no houses. It sounded like a woodwind of sort, something that sounded very spiritual. All of my neighbors were pretty old, and I can guarantee that none of them spend their time walking in the woods playing a flute. We heard this for hours. We left at about 8 o'clock that night, and when we walked back, you could hear it somewhat across the valley. I didn't hear it again for about 2 years after that. But one night I woke up at 3 o'clock in the morning. My bed was right next to the window, and I had cracked it to let in some fresh air while I slept. I woke up to the sound of the flute, coming right outside my window. I was too worried to look out and see what it was. It went on for about an hour before it finally stopped playing, and to this day, I have never heard it again. When I was 15 or so, a group of my friends and I all slept over at the leader of our friend group's house. This guy lived in the most absolutely rural area of our rural town, basically in the middle of the woods, a house just surrounded by thick walls of trees. In the evening, we decided to go out and start a bonfire deep in the woods. So we packed up, got all of our materials, and went straight out there. On the way to the spot that we'd be making our campfire at, he told us about how messed up and creepy his woods are, and the numerous things he's seen. White, skinny figures peeking around the shed, staring at him and running off when he looked at it, screaming and whispers from the woods, figures watching him, all that good stuff. It set the mood pretty well. By around 7 o'clock that night, we had the campfire set up, and it was pitch black outside, as it was the middle of winter in New Hampshire. I can still remember how creepy the whole vibe was that night. You couldn't see a single thing besides the ring of light coming from the fire. Everything else was just a black wall of nothingness, and the sound of the forest was so quiet that the silence was almost deafening. At least it was if we weren't talking. We ended up needing more firewood and a few other things that we were using for the campfire, so the leader took me to go with him to get it. Without a flashlight or any light source, he and I walked the 1.5 mile long trail back to his house in complete and utter darkness. It was all good. We were talking, joking with each other, having a good time, and just hanging out, when the first noises started. He immediately made me stop talking. To my left and my right were a bunch of different sounds: screaming, laughing, talking and whispering, shouting, people saying unintelligible words. It sounded like there was something around 20 people just surrounding us. The natural night vision had finally set in a decent amount, and I looked over at my friend, who had his head down, and didn't say a single word. Known for being a complete goofball and a wild, funny dude, I had never seen him look so shaken and serious in my life. He had this look to him that still kind of haunts me to this day, as I knew him pretty well, and he always portrayed himself as the fearless leader type. Seeing him so shaken up and afraid was very unsettling. I started to say something along the lines of, "What the heck is that?" before he cut me off and told me to be quiet, face forward, and not to pay attention to any of the sounds. I did what he said, and the next 3 minutes or so were incredibly uncomfortable and terrifying. I remember feeling sick to my stomach. By the time we reached his house, the sounds had stopped. We both grabbed what we needed in total silence. That's when I could really listen to the sheer quietness of that night. No birds, no sticks falling, not a single sound. Absurdly silent. We walked back to the campsite, and nothing else occurred that night. It's still my most unsettling and bizarre experience that I have no explanation for, and I'll never forget it. My family owns a factory in the north of England. The building is 1890s as far as I can tell, and was built as a large shed for boilers that provided steam to power the steam engines in the big mill next door. The mill has since been demolished. It has a large water tank underneath it and a system to collect rainwater. The roof is made with cast iron trestles that incorporate internal gutters. It's fascinating. My brother is convinced that the place is haunted. Stuff apparently moves around on its own, and voices have been heard in the factory from the office when the factory was empty. We had an old bloke working for us a few years back who swears he saw the ghost of a man on several occasions. He did used to secretly drink several cans of John Smith's bitter whilst on shift though, so who knows. But he's not the only one. So far, I haven't experienced anything. But if I do, I'll be sure to let you know. This is a description of events that happened to me during my time as a security guard at a local factory. Obviously, I can't give any locations or names, but I will say that it happened in Germany. I have been working at this place for about 2 years. It's an old chemical factory that was built in the early 1900s before World War I. I don't know much more about its history other than that, though. For the first few months, all went pretty smoothly, but after a while, I started noticing some things that were quite odd. The first thing I noticed on my nightly rounds was that in some buildings, the lights seemed to turn on or off on their own. But I wrote that off as the old electrical installations, which could act quirky sometimes, or employees forgetting to turn the light off. Employees could act quirky too. The thing is, that stuff kept happening, even when there was nobody else but me on the premises. I could check a building at the start of my round, only to return 30 minutes later, to find every light in the building turned on, but the doors still locked. There was one particular building that constantly gave me the creeps. A flat, one-story building that was basically one long hallway with office rooms on either side. Every time I walked through that hallway to check if all the offices were locked, I felt like somebody was just behind me, looking over my shoulder. It was also in this building that I heard whispers or sighs from one of the offices, but they were always empty, and all of the electronic equipment that could have caused those noises were turned off or in some cases unplugged. Another building that I had weird stuff happen in was the metal workshop. The weirdest thing was that one night I heard a noise from within, and when I entered, all of the machines, the drills, the saws, everything, were on and running. I just ran in, hit the main emergency switch, and got out of there. That night, again, I was the only one there. I tried to talk with some of my colleagues about it, but they said that if I wanted to keep my job, I'd better stop talking about these things, as management didn't take too kindly to people asking questions. So, I haven't asked any more questions, but I definitely have some. I'm from a small town in the middle of Denmark, and my grandfather used to live about 10 kilometers from us. He was what you would roughly translate as a nature caretaker. He lives at the place and gets paid to take care of it. The place that he lived was in a protected area in the forest, just where Denmark's biggest river meets a huge lake. The place had a lot of old buildings, an old paper factory, and a watermill. It used to be run by the monks of the Benedictine order. They built the mill to utilize the water stream to power the machines at the paper factory. The place is basically called the Monastery Mill. Most buildings are from the late 1500s to 1700s, but some of them are from 1100. All the way up until the 1800s, the place was run by the monks. On the other side of the river lived the nuns of the Benedictine order, who were said to have a bad relationship with the monks. No one really knows what started this feud. Firstly, it was small. Food would go missing from the monks' stock. Then the watermill would stop, and they would realize an insane amount of wood was blocking the water. Lastly, they would wake up to find cattle and chickens had been killed. And one night, the paper factory, which was built entirely of wood, was set on fire. Ever since that day, nobody had seen the monks. Everyone thought that they had left the mill to go somewhere else, as the order had many monasteries across the country. Well, 4 years ago, when I had just turned 18, my granddad was going hunting in Sweden. He asked me if I could take care of his place and his dogs for a couple of days, and since I didn't have a car yet, I would just sleep there and take the bus to school in the morning. The place is beautiful, and I was so excited to spend some time there. When I went to sleep the first night, I was woken up at exactly 12 o'clock by what sounded like a small church bell. It rang for a couple of minutes, and then it stopped. A small bell the monks used to use to call mass was just outside my granddad's house, so I assumed that's what I had heard. But when I woke up the next morning and checked out the bell, it was tied tightly, so no wind or person could have made that bell ring. The next night, it happened again. It woke me up at exactly midnight and rang for a couple of minutes. I slowly made my way to the front door, which was made of glass, to look at the bell. And there were my granddad's 2 dogs, looking out while growling. I swear when I looked out, I saw a bald man wearing a long white dress robe type thing disappearing into the woods, almost like he was floating. I called my dad sobbing and asked him to come and pick me up, and he did. We both went back the next day, checked on the bell, and it was still tied up. My dad then confided in me that even though he doesn't believe in that stuff, as he put it, he had had many weird experiences as a kid there, and he still couldn't find any explanation for most of them. Fast forward to last year. My granddad was still living there, and the council decided to split the river and make it wider. Had something to do with the forest environment. I didn't really exactly get why. It took weeks for them to plan it out. And then, the day came when all the machinery to start the expansion got kicked on. They only got to work for a couple of hours, though, until they had to stop, because as they were digging, they had found bones. Just a couple, no big deal. But what they soon realized was that by the river, on the monk's side, there was a mass grave. After specialists were called and weeks of digging commenced, they approximated that the grave had about 40 bodies in it, all from the 1800s. At that point, everyone realized that the monks had never left. What happened to them at that paper factory, though, no one knows.